do you plead to 5 counts of conspiracy to commit intentional interference with the performance of election duties and 1 count of conspiracy to commit criminal trespass? How do you plead to the 6 counts of conspiracy to commit intentional interference with the performance of election duties?
Guilty.
Sounds like when she releases the Kraken, it's going to be on Trump. Former Trump attorney Sidney Powell pleaded guilty, that's right, guilty with a G today in the Georgia election interference case as part of a plea deal with prosecutors. That means she could testify against the former president. Powell was one of his lawyers, of course, after the 2020 election. She publicly and repeatedly pushed false conspiracy theories about the results. Powell agreed to 6 years of probation, around $9,000 in fines, and she will submit an apology letter to the citizens of Georgia. Back with me tonight to discuss former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who spent 25 years as a federal prosecutor. Joyce, it's extraordinary. My team just said to me after a very difficult segment covering the war, they said, it's okay, we have a much lighter segment coming up next. And to think a lighter segment, it's about the former president and his former lawyer and a guilty plea. That doesn't seem light at all when you think about the grand scope of things. What were your takeaways? Because we need to tell our audience, you predicted that she would turn and plead.
Well, I don't think I can take too much credit, Steph, because this seems like a fairly obvious decision for Powell to make. She's a lawyer. She knows what the inside of a prison looks like, and she was facing as much as 5 to 20 years of custody in Georgia with very strong evidence against her. And what made it worse was that the co-defendant who has already pled guilty, Scott Hall, was involved with her in the Coffee County voting machine intrusions. So he would have likely testified as her, adding just even more reason for her to consider this plea. It's an interesting situation. This is how these prosecutions look. There was a lot of criticism early on of Fani Willis for indicting so many people in one conspiracy, but she knew that the trajectory in these cases is that as you get close to trial, people have a much more realistic read on the evidence and defendants begin to plead guilty and cooperate.
Amazing. It was just 3 weeks ago. She was very publicly saying she did absolutely nothing. In order for her to get a deal like this from the government, did she have to give them something big?
I think so. This is a very good deal. She pleads guilty to misdemeanor charges only. She avoids going to prison. This is the sort of deal that you don't just hand out like a party favor. And so it suggests to me that Powell will be testifying against Trump. We know that she was in the room with him, most notably during this December 18 meeting in the Oval Office, where she walks in and peddles her crazy stories about foreign interference in the election and offers herself up as someone who could become a special counsel and be involved in the military seizing voting machines after a national emergency is declared. And Trump, strangely enough, doesn't reject her crazy nonsense ideas out of hand, but actually is considering them, to the horror of members of the White House counsel's office who are present. So this seems like something that she could do along with testimony against some of the other defendants.
We also learned today that Ken Chesebro rejected a plea deal. You wrote in an MSNBC.com piece that there's likely only a few other plea deals to go around. Does Sidney Powell's deal motivate some of these other defendants to get on board and cut a deal while they still can?
Right, I think it does. This is an interesting situation because the charges are so wide-ranging. And prosecutors will look for key witnesses on each of the points that are important to them. They will also look for corroborating testimony. There could likely be many more pleas in this case. But these sorts of deals, no felony charges, no prison time, will go to the people who have the most to offer. Chesebro's involved in a different part of this conspiracy. He's the author of the memos that provide the path for failing to certify the election on January 6th. Fortunately, his plan fails, but he is involved with Trump again in a very close way. And importantly, this week, Judge Scott McAfee ruled that all of these memos could come into evidence, that although Chesebro claimed that they were attorney-client privileged information, that the judge would permit the prosecution to offer them because of the crime fraud exception. That's terrible news for Chesebro. I suspect he may be reconsidering whether he wants to engage in negotiations with Fani Willis, too.
What about terrible news for Trump? If you're his attorney, how concerned are you tonight versus 24 hours ago before the Sidney Powell plea deal?
Well, Steve Sadow, Trump's lawyer, put about as good of a face on this news as you possibly could. He said he was happy to hear about Powell's testimony. He expected that it would fully exonerate his client. And look, to be fair, we don't know what Sidney Powell's testimony will be. Perhaps she will exonerate Trump, although the type of deal she has suggests that her evidence was valuable to prosecutors as opposed to gutting their case. Trump's lawyers have to be very nervous about what Sidney Powell is going to say, but also about the next domino to fall. Who else will end up cooperating before their client goes to trial?
Joyce Vance, maybe her testimony will exonerate Trump. Maybe not.